So this is yeah. So we're doing if one can't lose such a right in these circumstances, one never had it in the first place. In Criminal Law and Philosophy by Michael Otsuka. So, get back to some of these legal arguments. We've had some interesting legal arguments on Philosophy Roulette about, just war theory and things like that. Fun stuff. As always, please ask questions. Here we go. On what has come to be known as the moral responsibility account of liability to defensive killing, it is one's moral responsibility for being a threat rather than culpable behavior that renders one liable to defensive killing. Okay. Moreover, one's lack of moral responsibility for being a threat grounds one's non-liability to defensive killing. Among its many virtues, the moral defensive force offers a sustained and powerful critique of the moral responsibility account. Jonathan Kwong also offers an alternative account of liability to defensive killing, which he calls the moral status account. I have defended the moral responsibility account and am among one of the targets of Kwong's critique. In this article, I press a line of objection to his moral status account. Okay, so we're going to try to figure out why you're allowed to, defend yourself if you, by using force. Why is there a legal reason that you can? I don't know. Granted, it seems like you should be able to defend yourself, but how much can you defend yourself? It seems, if I had to guess, once you stop defending yourself and you become the threat, but who draws that line? We've got a lot of stand your ground laws nowadays, and I think they're terrible, really. People do not understand escalation. Escalation is just mind-bogglingly ignored to me. It's like you're just creating people with attitudes lately. It's bad. It's like you have to de-escalate, not escalate. And we shouldn't be making laws to encourage escalation. Anywho, I shall orient my discussion around two cases in which, on the moral responsibility account, it is deemed permissible to kill another in self-defense because she is morally responsible for her behavior, even though she is also blameless. As we shall see in a moment, Kwong's moral status account reaches a different verdict regarding permissibility across these two cases. The first case involves someone who mistakenly but non-culpably tries to kill an innocent person in self-defense. Mistaken attacker. The identical twin brother of a notorious serial killer is driving during a stormy night in a remote area when his car breaks down. Unaware that his brother has recently escaped from prison and is known to be hiding in this area, he knocks on the door of the nearest house, seeking to phone for help. On opening the door, resident justifiably believes the harmless twin is the killer. Resident has been warned by the authorities that the killer will certainly attack anyone he meets on sight, and so resident lunges at him with a knife. If mistaken resident stabs the innocent twin, he would be doing something that appears to be objectively wrong. He would be killing a non-responsible person who, it seems, is not in fact liable to be killed and whose killing cannot be justified on any other objective grounds either. But such a killing would be subjectively morally justifiable, since mistaken resident would be acting on the justified but false belief grounded in a reasonable assessment of the evidence that he is defending himself against an attack by a culpable serial killer. Is mistaken resident liable to be defensively killed if this is the only way to save the life of the innocent stranded twin? Okay, so they're asking, can the non-killing twin kill the resident in their own self-defense? Proponents of the moral responsibility account maintain that he is. They infer liability on the grounds that, as I wrote in 1994, a morally responsible agent takes a gamble by placing his moral immunity on the line when he engages in such avoidable risky activity as the lunging at someone with a knife. I wonder why they have the his and he in brackets. Did they say her and hers, or he and she before, or do they want to make it like they thems nowadays? I don't know. Okay. There I was drawing an implicit analogy between the bad moral luck of becoming a morally becoming morally liable to be killed, and Ronald Dworkin's notion within the realm of distributive justice of bad option luck. Someone voluntarily chooses to gamble with his moral worth, so to speak, by knowingly engaging in risky activity that might imperil the innocent. Mistaken resident who tries to stab someone who turns out to be innocent is morally unlucky in much the same way as someone who gambles on the stock market and loses is financially unlucky. The upshot of such gambles are not unfair, but they are a matter of bad option luck rather than bad brute luck. I mean, I guess you are engaging in a semi-risky behavior, but there's a big difference between gambling on the stock market and doing nothing when your life might be in danger. And in this case, mistaken resident, they were told their life was in danger. So if you have money to throw at the stock market, you have like maybe enough money to not starve. But like if you are told that there is a killer on the loose, you have to act to protect yourself. So there's a difference there between getting involved in risky trades versus not doing anything when there is a killer at your door. Okay. Author says, now let us contrast the case of a mistaken resident with the following case, which involves someone who accidentally and non-culpably imperils the life of another. Conscientious driver who always keeps her car well maintained and always drives carefully and alertly, decides to drive to the movies. On the way, a freak accident occurs that causes their car to veer out of control in the direction of a pedestrian. The out-of-control car will now kill the pedestrian unless the pedestrian destroys the car with a grenade, thereby killing the driver. Jeff McMahon, who is the originator of this case, offers the following commentary on it, with which I am in agreement. Although her act is of a type that is generally objectively permissible, and although she has taken due care to avoid harming anyone, she has had bad luck. The risk she knew her act carried has now, and probably and through no fault of her own, been realized. Because she knew of the small risk to others that her driving would impose, and because she nonetheless voluntarily chose to drive when there was no moral reason for her to do so, she is morally liable to defensive action to prevent her from killing an innocent bystander. Yeah, and I think what's actually more interesting here is the AI thing. Like, if there was an AI in charge, how do you who does the AI save? Does it save the pedestrian or does it save the driver? And that might be part of artificial intelligence ethics now that you'd have situations like this that are going to come up. Okay. Kwong concurs with McMahon and me that mistaken resident has, by lunging at an innocent with a knife, rendered himself liable to be defensively killed. Yet he rejects our claim that conscientious driver has also rendered herself liable. He rejects our moral responsibility account of liability in favor of his moral status account, which is attentive to an interesting feature that is alleged to differentiate mistaken resident from conscientious driver. According to Kwong, in lunging with a knife at the person who he believes to be threatening his life, mistaken resident acts as if the person whom he confronts lacks the right that he in fact possesses. Moreover, Kwong maintains that to treat others as if they lack moral rights against having harm imposed is a grave matter. He says that when you act in this way, you treat others as if they are not entitled to the equal concern and respect all persons are normally owed, and so it's appropriate that you bear special liability for your actions when the people you harm do in fact have rights against the harmful acts you perform. By contrast, conscientious driver never acts on the assumption that anyone lacks rights that she in fact possesses. The justification of our traffic laws to which she conforms, which appeals to a calculation of the costs and benefits of driving, include the cost of accidental deaths, does not depend on any assumption that people lack rights not to be harmed that they in fact possess. Nor, of course, does she hurtle accidentally out of control towards a pedestrian on the assumption that this pedestrian lacks rights not to be harmed. On such a case, Kwong writes, unlike the moral responsibility view, the moral status account does not implausibly declare that conscientious driver is liable to defensive harm. The evidence-related permissibility of getting behind the wheel of a vehicle and imposing a tiny risk of harm on others does not depend on treating those others as if they lack any rights against them. Conscientious driver is non-liable to defensive harm for the following reason. When you do not treat others as if they lack rights against harm, when the justification for your acts accords the appropriate weight to the moral claims each person has, then it would be unreasonable to hold you liable for the harms that result from your act. More generally, Kwong writes, the moral status conception declares that what matters is whether a person judged from the evidence relative standpoint acts as if others lack rights against harm. When and only when our actions have this particular feature, treating others with something less than the concern and respect they are due, we make ourselves liable to defense of harm. Kwong has identified a deep and interesting moral difference between cases in which one treats others as if they lack rights that they in fact possess, and cases in which one does not treat others in this way. Nevertheless, I shall argue that Kwong's appeal to this distinction ultimately fails to support his position that mistaken resident is liable to defensive killing, whereas conscientious driver is not. This is because the very considerations regarding the reasonableness of our demands that Kwong advances in support of the non-liability of conscientious driver will carry over to immunize mistaken resident from such liability as well. These considerations will establish that we should never have posited that the twin had a right in the first place not to be subject to resident's defensive attack. I think this is what I said earlier, that the existence of the killer means that they have pre-forfeited their right not to be subject to defensive attack. So yeah. Okay. But like, I think this is actually reasonably clear, but like, the question is, how much of a mess do you get yourself? How much responsibility? Because the world is a dangerous place. Like, just by going outside, by streaming online, by engaging in chat, I guess like there, you are inevitably engaging with the world, which can be, you know, random, dangerous, and other stuff. Now, the Kwong says, look, are you treating everyone else with respect? And if you are not treating them with their due respect, then you are opening yourself up to getting feedback. This is the fuck around, and then you get to find out. If you fucked around, you get to find out. Or you are liable to finding out. But the author is saying, look, yeah, some people, but if you fuck around, you find out. But there's the thing, it's that, are you treating other people with respect, or is the fuck around, find out just more universal? I guess that's the big question here. All right. Author says, I should note that I am offering an internal critique of Kwong's position. I am, however, somewhat skeptical of Kwong's claim that one establishes what claim rights people have on the basis of the considerations he offers regarding the correlative duties it is reasonable to demand of others. Moreover, such an approach to ascertaining what rights we have would, I believe, be difficult to square with the moral responsibility account that I have defended. In the remainder of this article, I shall mainly bracket these general doubts and assume, for the sake of argument, the perspective of someone who accepts Kwong's approach to establishing rights by means of a particular account of what it is reasonable to demand of others. Without further ado, here is my critique. In explaining why conscientious driver is not liable to be killed, Kwong writes, we only have moral rights that others refrain from performing harmful or potentially harmful acts when we can reasonably demand that they refrain from performing the act. It is not reasonable to demand that others refrain from careful and conscientious behavior when the behavior poses only an extremely low risk of harm. My challenge to Kwong is this. Someone who believes this about conscientious driver must, on pain of inconsistency, also maintain that it is unreasonable to demand that mistaken resident refrain from engaging in defensive force when faced with his predicament. According to Kwong, mistaken resident acts on the basis of justified beliefs, and therefore his act of self-defense is permissible in the evidence relative sense. He thus cannot be culpable. He has full epistemic excuse. How, in the light of this, can it be reasonable to demand that resident refrain from doing that which a reasonable assessment of the evidence implies to be necessary to save his own life from an attack by a culpable aggressor who has forfeited his immunity from defensive harm? On behalf of his claim that mistaken resident renders himself liable to be killed, Kwong maintains that surely resident lacks the standing to complain if the twin must break resident's arm to prevent him from being killed. While this may be true, it does not serve to differentiate mistaken resident from conscientious driver. This is because conscientious driver would also lack standing to complain if pedestrian must break driver's arm to save his own life. In both cases, we would be able to appeal to a lesser evil justification for imposition of the lesser harm on one of two culpable parties. In differentiating conscientious driver from mistaken resident, Kwong appeals to a more general distinction, which is captured by the following pair of questions. 1. Under what considerations does a person have a claim not to be harmed by a particular type of act performed by another person? And 2. Has some particular person, A, waived, transferred, or forfeited this claim not to be harmed by another person, B? Kwong maintains that the answer to the latter question depends on what A has actually done and not B's evidence about what A has done. This is because there are powerful reasons why transfer, waiver, and forfeiture should depend on what the right holder actually does rather than anyone's evidence about what she's done. Most importantly, this grants the right holder a more effective degree of control over the right, something that is typically of central importance. Kwong maintains, however, that the same argument doesn't apply when the question of whether someone has a right in the first place. When we're deciding whether the person in general have a right that others refrain from defying, it makes sense to focus on what we can reasonably demand of others. For example, I can reasonably demand that no one speak at a volume louder than a whisper on a busy street. Can they reasonably demand that? These remarks apply to mistaken resident as follows. Having established that the twin who knocks on resident's door has a right not to be subject to lethal defensive harm, it follows that the twin is not liable to suffer such harm unless he has waived, transferred, or forfeited his claim not to be harmed. Moreover, he waives, transferred, or forfeits his right only by behaving in a particular fashion, which is a matter of facts rather than the evidence available to resident. I would now like to press the following challenge to Kwong's attempt to differentiate mistaken resident from conscientious driver. Recall that I pressed the point earlier that it would be unreasonable to expect resident to refrain from defending himself in the predicament in which he finds himself. Now I can fully grant Kwong's claim that such unreasonableness does not bear on the question of whether the twin has waived, transferred, or forfeited any rights he possesses not to be subject to lethal defensive harm. Such unreasonableness does, however, bear on the question of whether we should have posited that the twin ever had a right in the first place against being subject to lethal defensive harm in the circumstances in which he found himself. Nothing Kwong has said blocks the following challenge. Given the unreasonable burden on people in the predicament of mistaken resident that such a right would impose, we should never have posited a right in the first place against being subject to defensive harm in the circumstances in which the twin found himself. That makes sense. If the twin is finding himself like you've got a perfect twin of somebody who's a mass murderer, that person, you can't say that person actually in that one situation, we should all assume that it's the twin and not the mass murderer. That would be unreasonable for everyone else, and so we can't have given them the right in that one instance. Yeah, it would in fact be author says it would in fact be unreasonable to posit such a right in the first place precisely because, on Kwong's account, the rights bearer exercises extensive control over whether he loses his right. He cannot lose such a right simply by inadvertently and innocently manifesting overwhelming evidence to any reasonable observer that he is a dangerous serial killer who is about to attack. Yeah, I mean, he can't lose it, but if he never had it. Kwong opens himself up to my challenge when he writes the following. To establish a person's liability to defensive force, we must ask whether that person threatens the moral rights of others by defying. And the answer to that question cannot be determined by asking whether it would be wrong for the person to defy if she knew all the facts. Rather, it must be determined by asking, among other things, what it would be reasonable for others to demand of her given the importance of the affected activities, the costs involved, the options available, and the relative harms that others might suffer. It would, however, author says now, that was a quote, it would, however, be unreasonable of others to demand that people such as resident refrain from using lethal force to defend themselves against what any reasonable person would be justified in believing on the evidence to be a culpable aggressor who will murder them if they do not strike first. Given what Kwong says in the passage I've just quoted, it follows from such unreasonableness that resident does not threaten any moral right of the twin in lethally defending himself against him. I now quote a passage from Kwong's book that offers further support of my claim that resident contravenes no no right of others, because it would be unreasonable to demand that people in residents' predicament refrain from exercising defensive force. Kwong writes that many everyday acts impose very small risks of harm on others, yet these risks are sufficiently low that others cannot reasonably demand that we refrain from performing them, and thus we contravene no person's moral rights in performing these acts. Yeah, so I mean, basically, other people can't tell me to go driving because on the very small chance that some freak accident happens and I hit them with the car. Could happen, but it's unlikely. Note that the innocent people run a very small ex ante risk of being harmed by someone who conscientiously exercises defensive force only in circumstances in which the evidence justifies such force. It would appear to follow from the passage I've just quoted that one cannot reasonably demand that people such as mistaken resident refrain from performing such defensive acts. The quoted passage therefore appears to commit Kwong to the conclusion that resident does not contravene Twin's moral rights in attacking him. I guess, yeah, because the point is that mistaken resident is in such an unusual circumstance that they can't be are not. It'd be unreasonable. It'd be an overburdensome for them to double check the identity of the person that looks just like the killer. That would be overburdensome on mistaken resident in this very unusual, like, narrow case. So it's a low probability case, and so that's why you can't expect resident to double check everything in the extreme low probability case. A further problem with Kwong's account arises. Why, one might ask, can't the behavior that, as a matter of fact, results in Twins losing his right not to be subject to defensive force be the behavior of knocking on mistaken resident's door while looking just like a dangerous escaped serial killer who will attack unless attacked first? Presumably, Kwong's answer would be that if one could lose one's right in this manner, then one would not have an effective enough degree of control over the right. But we don't ultimately care about the effective degree of control over the rights we have. Rather, we ultimately care about having an effective degree of control over our lives. Such control is reduced not merely by having less control over the rights we possess against being subject to defensive force. It is also reduced by having fewer rather than more rights in the first place against being subject to defensive force. For this reason, I do not think that Kwong can sustain his contrasting approach to answering his two general questions, the first of which is what rights do we have, and the second of which is how can we lose those rights. Okay. Yeah. This was okay. You know, it's interesting. Like, why do we have rights and how do we lose them? Well, what do we actually have? What do we want to have? We want to have control over our lives. And in the very low chances of like some of these situations, yeah, whatever you do, given your best option at the time, can't be said to be the wrong answer. And so the idea that you have to double check or you can lose your rights at these times, no, you can't lose your rights if, given everything you know at the time, you are acting in the right way, and anyone else in that similar position would also reasonably, whatever reasonably means in this case, could also be expected to act similarly. And so just because you are violating someone else's rights, they may not have had those rights at that time through no fault of their own. But that happens sometimes. You can lose rights through no fault of your own. So you can, in some sense, in the eyes of the law, you can lose your rights, and that's not a question. Should you sometimes? That's the moral question. Maybe yes, maybe no. But like, you could feel morally bad that the twin who has never hurt anyone got killed, but legally is the question here. And so the moral question is different than the legal question, and who's liable. And so the person who's the mistaken resident, they're not liable. They may feel bad about it after the fact, but they could not have known that at the time. And so I guess this is the philosophical question here is, where do the moral and the legal pieces come apart? And they come apart when there is limited knowledge. You've got a limited knowledge of the situation, and you have to act to defend your life. And so this is the defensive act at that point, where you have to act in a short amount of time, given incomplete information. Then at that point, the legal status governing people goes away. And then you have to act as best you can at that time. But if you don't have a right, then you can't complain legally that they violated your rights. You can only complain morally that you are not responsible in the first place. But that's not what that's the point here, is that you may have a moral beef that someone attacked you for no good reason, but legally they did have a good reason. Okay, that's it for this one, unless anyone has any questions. It's not a bad paper. Straightforward, very straightforward. Criminal law and philosophy. Why do we have There's Ellis out of the London School of Economics. Interesting. So why do we so now we can actually understand the title. If one can't lose such a right in these circumstances, one never had it in the first place. That's right. You lost. If someone you can't lose your right to not being harmed in certain circumstances. But in these circumstances, if you can be harmed because someone else is defending themselves, you never had the right to not be harmed. But they were just very unusual circumstances. But you can't lose the right. You just never had it. So I was trying to parse what this actually meant. Now it makes sense. So the rights mean, in very unusual circumstances, the status of your rights is sort of suspended. And so you never had it. Okay.